President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is expected to have a key role in shaping the address to Congress. Bannon has had a hand in all of the president's major addresses and policy proposals. And for one of the first times since inauguration, Bannon offered an extended explanation of his worldview during remarks last week at CPAC.
If you look at the lines of work, I kind of break it out into three verticals or three buckets. The first is kind of national security and sovereignty, and that's your intelligence, the Defense Department, Homeland Security. The second line of work is what I refer to as economic nationalism. The third, broadly, line of work is what is deconstruction of the administrative state. If you think they're going to give you your country back without a fight, you are sadly mistaken. Every day it is going to be a fight. The center core of what we believe, that we're a nation with an economy, not an economy just in some global marketplace with open borders, but we are a nation with a culture and a reason for being.
Parts of Bannon's worldview have reportedly come from this book, The Fourth Turning, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. It was published in 1997 and co-written by Neil Howe and William Strauss. Because the book could have such an influence on President Trump's policy agenda, we wanted to know more about it. So we're glad now to have Neil Howe in our Washington bureau. Neil's current title is Managing Director of Demography at Hedgeye Risk Management. Welcome to you, Neil.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So such an interesting concept, the fourth turning. Some critics have pointed at Steve Bannon's interest in your book and concluded that he believes America faces an inevitable social and political crisis. Is that what your book argues?
Well, we do argue that history does have seasons, and we did argue in our book, which did come out in 1997, that starting in the first decade of the 20th century, probably being kicked off by a great devaluation, that we would be entering that kind of era where we would have creative destruction of public institutions and ultimately could be a new founding moment in American history. We've tended to have those about every 80 or 90 years going back many centuries.
Neil, we played that clip of Steve Bannon discussing three pillars of his current worldview: national security, economic nationalism, and the deconstruction of the administrative state. How do you tie those pillars to the argument of your book?
I think they're consistent with it. I will say that we did predict in our book that in the era we're living in now, we would see the rise of sort of economic populism tied to conservative social values, which is essentially what we're seeing. This could have been picked up by either party, and certain elements of Bernie Sanders' campaign were going in that direction as well. But at least in this election, the Republicans succeeded and are to some extent running with it.
Yeah, and you've said that you don't know Steve Bannon well. As you well know, he has many critics and has even been called a quote-unquote white nationalist by House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. Do you think that Steve Bannon's worldview has been misinterpreted by some?
Again, you're right. I don't know him well. I will say that I've worked on him with him on several film projects. I have never noticed anything like that. And I know that there have been some pretty long feature stories and by none other than the mainstream media, which I think give a much better picture of Steve Bannon than the remarks by Nancy Pelosi.
Well, you say that you never intended your book as a political manifesto. You mentioned some among Bernie Sanders supporters who have found some elements of your book particularly appealing. Notably, I would guess the rise of the millennials that you talk about in your book. But why do you think that your book has really kind of struck a chord with some political minds?
I think there's a great thirst to figure out where history is going, particularly at a time like this. You know, we Westerners believe that history goes in straight lines, either straight line progress most of the time, or when things don't look good, we think it's decline, and of course that scares us. Bill and I, in our books, all of our books going back to Generations, which we wrote in 1991, prefer to look at the wisdom of traditional societies, which tend to see time as more cyclical. That is to say, history is seasonal to some extent. And that's how we look at the timing of many of the broader social rhythms of American history. You know, cycles of the K-wave in economics, cycles of realigning elections, cycles of risk-taking and family life and drug abuse, and a lot of other long-term cycles that social historians have recognized. We see them as being timed and governed by the process of generational aging. And that is something that in all of our books we've tried to explore and sort of fill in what that insight says about where we're headed.
Last question for you, Neil. In your limited interactions with Steve Bannon, we know they've been limited interactions. What is it, though, that you've learned about him?
I would say that he's real. I think the thing that maybe people don't recognize is, given at least my interaction with him and a lot of our activities have been in the realm of culture and film. He has more of an aesthetic perspective than certainly not one that I would call as primarily ideological, certainly not religious. He tends to be attracted by looking at how the mood of an era feels and what components naturally fit together. And I think at a time of rapid change politically, as we're now seeing, and possibly, I think, a realignment of the two political parties, which is unfolding right now, I think being able to get outside the box of politics and ideology, taking a longer-term perspective and looking more broadly, more culturally at what's happening, could be a smart thing on his part.
All right, Neil Howe, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.